The morning sun cast long shadows through the reinforced windows of the African Development Bank headquarters in Abidjan. Security guards had completed their third sweep of Conference Room 7B, ensuring no unauthorized recording devices remained hidden behind the mahogany panels or beneath the polished oak table. At precisely 2:30 p.m., 14 carefully vetted journalists from the world's most prestigious news organizations filed into what they believed would be a routine economic briefing. Sarah Mitchell from the Financial Times adjusted her digital recorder, noting the irony that in this age of smartphones and constant connectivity, they had been asked to surrender all personal devices at the entrance. Only approved recording equipment was permitted, a standard security protocol for sensitive economic discussions that might move markets if leaked prematurely. James Patterson from Bloomberg reviewed his prepared questions about regional mining policies, his pen poised over a fresh notepad. The afternoon's agenda seemed straightforward: discuss Burkina Faso's new banking requirements for mining operations, analyze potential impacts on foreign investment, and perhaps gather a few quotes about the upcoming African Economic Summit. David Chen from Reuters checked his watch as the last journalist entered. Representatives from CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and major African outlets settled into their assigned seats. The diversity of the group suggested the African Development Bank considered this briefing significant, though none of them understood quite how significant. The conference room itself spoke of serious business. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Abidjan's bustling financial district, where glass towers housed regional offices of international banks and multinational corporations. The symbolism wasn't lost on the journalists. They were literally looking down on the institutions that controlled much of Africa's wealth, though from inside a building dedicated to African development. At exactly 2:45 p.m., a technician entered and activated the speakerphone system. The device, a sophisticated unit capable of crystal-clear international connections, sat in the center of the table like an altar to modern communication. None of the journalists suspected they were about to witness it become a weapon of economic warfare. Dr. Kwame Asante, the African Development Bank's chief economist, made the introductions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We're honored to have President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso joining us via phone to discuss his country's new mining sector banking regulations. President Traoré, can you hear us clearly? The voice that emerged from the speakerphone was calm, measured, and surprisingly young-sounding for a head of state. Good afternoon, Dr. Asante. I can hear you perfectly. Good afternoon to all the journalists present. I hope you're prepared for an educational discussion. The word educational would later be remembered by all 14 journalists as their first hint that this briefing would be unlike any other they had attended. Sarah Mitchell leaned forward slightly as Dr. Asante gestured for her to begin. She had covered African economics for 12 years through debt crises, commodity booms, and countless promises of reform. Her questions were sharp, informed, and designed to extract concrete information from political rhetoric. President Traoré, she began, your new policy requiring all mining companies to maintain their primary bank accounts within Burkina Faso has raised concerns among international investors. Doesn't this policy risk capital flight and reduced foreign investment in your mining sector? The response came without hesitation, but it wasn't the diplomatic deflection they expected. Traoré's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity, as if he were the one interviewing them. Ms. Mitchell, let me ask you something. If a company extracts gold from our soil, processes it with our water, transports it on our roads, using our citizens' labor, why should the profits from that gold sit in banks in London or New York? Why should our wealth fund their economies while our people lack basic infrastructure? The logic was simple, almost childlike in its directness, yet it cut through decades of complex economic arguments about capital mobility and investment security. Several journalists exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual evasive political response. James Patterson from Bloomberg seized the opening. But surely, President Traoré, you understand that international companies require the security and sophistication of global financial institutions? Burkina Faso's banking system, with respect, lacks the infrastructure to handle large-scale international transactions. There was a pause that lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for the journalists to wonder if the connection had been lost, short enough to maintain conversational flow. When Traoré spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more focused, more purposeful. "Mr. Patterson, would you like to know how much money from African resources is currently sitting in Western banks? Not the official figures that your institutions publish, not the estimates that development economists use in their papers, but the real numbers, the actual amounts that can be traced and verified." David Chen from Reuters felt his journalist instincts activate. This was no longer a policy discussion. This was the beginning of a revelation. "President Traoré, are you suggesting you have access to confidential banking information?" The laugh that came through the speakerphone was neither bitter nor triumphant. It was the laugh of someone who possessed knowledge that others assumed was impossible to obtain. "Mr. Chen, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. But you know what? Instead of simply telling you these facts, let me show you how easy they are to verify. You all have your recorders running? Excellent. Keep them on. You're about to witness something genuinely educational." The sound of electronic dialing filled the conference room with an almost musical series of tones. Each digit seemed to hang in the air, creating a rhythm that made the 14 journalists instinctively hold their breath. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a head of state making an unscheduled international call during a press briefing. The phone rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, a voice answered in French, professional and unsuspecting, "Société Générale, Private Wealth Management." "Director Arnaud speaking." The journalists froze. Société Générale was one of Europe's largest banks, with assets exceeding $1.3 trillion. The Private Wealth Management Division handled accounts for ultra-high net worth individuals, government officials, and institutional clients. This wasn't a customer service line that anyone could simply dial. "Bonjour, Arnaud," Traoré said in perfect French, his voice maintaining its calm, measured tone. "This is Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I believe you have been expecting my call." The sharp intake of breath through the speakerphone was audible to everyone in the room. Arnaud's voice, when it returned, carried a note of barely controlled panic. "Monsieur le Président, this is highly irregular. I cannot discuss confidential client information, especially not on an unsecured line with unknown parties present." Sarah Mitchell was frantically texting her editor in London, her fingers flying over the screen. "Urgent. Traoré making live calls to European banks during press briefing. This is unprecedented. Something major happening." "Arnaud," Traoré continued in French, which most of the international journalists understood, "you can and you will answer my questions. Because in exactly 60 seconds, I'm going to publicly release the complete documentation of every African leader's private account in your bank. Names, amounts, transaction histories, and sources of funds. Unless you answer my questions truthfully, you can verify the authenticity of this threat with your superiors if you wish, but I suggest you do it quickly. You now have 55 seconds. The conference room erupted in controlled chaos. Journalists were simultaneously taking notes, checking their recording equipment, and trying to process what they were witnessing. James Patterson was live tweeting the developments, his Bloomberg terminal showing real-time market reactions as word of the call began to spread through trading floors. Arnaud's voice came back shaking, the professional composure completely gone. "Monsieur le Président, please. What you're threatening would violate every banking law in Europe, every privacy protection we've built." 40 seconds, Arnaud," Traoré interrupted calmly. "I have 14 journalists from major international outlets listening to this call. They will report whatever happens next. This is your choice to make. Qu'est-ce que vous voulez savoir?" Arnaud's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want to know?" The journalists leaned forward collectively, pens poised, recording devices checked and rechecked. They were witnessing the impossible, a major European banker being interrogated live by an African president with no diplomatic protocols, no legal protections, just raw transparency as a weapon. "First question," Traoré said, switching to English for the benefit of all journalists present. "How much money from African governmental and resource extraction accounts is currently held in Société Générale's various divisions?" "I cannot. I mean," Arnaud's voice trailed off. 20 seconds, Monsieur Arnaud. Please answer the question." "D'accord, d'accord." As of this morning's reports, approximately $84 billion in direct governmental accounts from African nations and another $156 billion in corporate accounts directly related to African resource extraction operations. The silence in the conference room was absolute. $240 billion, nearly $260 billion from Africa sitting in just one French bank. Sarah Mitchell felt her worldview shifting as she wrote down the figures. This wasn't about mining regulations anymore. This was about the entire architecture of global finance. Second question, Traoré continued, his voice maintaining its unsettling calm. What interest rates does Société Générale pay on these African deposits? Arnaud was now speaking in a rush, as if speed might somehow minimize the damage he was causing to decades of carefully maintained secrecy. Standard rates vary between 0.1% and 0.5% annually, depending on the account type and balance maintenance requirements. And what return does Société Générale earn by investing this African money in your various financial instruments? Our average return on invested capital is approximately 12% annually across all divisions. David Chen was doing rapid calculations in his notepad. The mathematics of exploitation were becoming crystal clear. African money earning 12% for French banks, while Africans received 0.5%. So let me understand this clearly, Arnaud. You pay Africa 0.5% while earning 12% on our money. That represents approximately $28 billion in annual profit generated specifically from African deposits. Is this correct? Oui. Yes, that would be approximately correct. Third question. How many individual African government officials have personal accounts with your bank with balances exceeding $10 million? This question triggered a longer pause. When Arnaud spoke, his voice was resigned, defeated. 436 individuals across all African nations. The scratching of pens on paper filled the conference room as journalists frantically documented each revelation. James Patterson's Bloomberg terminal was showing unusual activity in European banking. Stocks. Sophisticated algorithms had detected abnormal keyword usage in financial communications and were beginning to react. And what is the combined personal wealth of these 436 African officials held in your bank? Approximately $219 billion in combined personal accounts. The implications were staggering. The personal wealth of African officials held in one French bank exceeded the GDP of most African nations. This wasn't just corruption. This was systematic wealth extraction on a continental scale. Thank you for your honesty, Arnaud. One final question, and then I'll let you return to your business. What happens to Société Générale if all these African accounts, governmental, corporate, and personal, were withdrawn simultaneously? The pause lasted 30 seconds. When Arnaud finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. It would trigger an immediate liquidity crisis. The bank would require emergency intervention from the European Central Bank within 48 hours to avoid collapse. Thank you for your complete honesty. You have been most helpful. Oh, and Arnaud, the documentation I mentioned earlier. It's now being transmitted to every major news outlet in the world. Good day. Traoré hung up on the Société Générale call, but before anyone in the conference room could fully process what they had just witnessed. He was dialing again. The electronic tone seemed ominous now, like a countdown to financial apocalypse. Barclays International Private Banking Division, Director Phillips speaking. The British accent was crisp, professional, unsuspecting, exactly like Arnaud's had been 3 minutes earlier. The journalists realized they were about to witness the same scenario replayed with Britain's second-largest bank. Mr. Phillips, this is President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. I just had a very illuminating conversation with your counterpart at Société Générale. 14 international journalists are listening to this call. Would you like to voluntarily disclose your African holdings? Or shall we do this the more difficult way? Phillips attempted to maintain British diplomatic composure, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone trained to handle difficult clients. President Traoré, I'm quite sure you understand the principles of client confidentiality and banking privacy. These are not merely corporate policies, but legal requirements under British law. Mr. Phillips? Traoré's voice took on a sharper edge. I have documentation showing that President Samuel Okono of Nigeria has $4.8 billion in personal accounts with your bank, funds that according to Nigerian law should be in the national treasury. I have similar documentation for 23 other African leaders. Shall I continue reading these details to the journalists, or will you cooperate? Sarah Mitchell had her editor on a secure line now, whispering urgent updates while simultaneously taking notes. Her editor's voice was tense. Sarah, whatever is happening there, it's moving markets. European bank stocks are down 8% in the last 10 minutes. Keep recording everything. Phillips's composure cracked audibly. How did you... Those accounts are encrypted, protected by the highest levels of security. How I obtained this information is irrelevant, Mr. Phillips. The question is whether Barclays wants to be known as the bank that enabled the systematic theft of African resources or the bank that came clean when confronted with the truth. You have 10 seconds to decide. We hold approximately $189 billion in African-related accounts, split roughly 60-40 between personal and governmental. Interest rates paid to these accounts? Standard commercial rates, typically 0.2% to 0.8% depending on account type. And Barclays' profits from investing this African money? I don't have exact figures immediately available, but I would estimate perhaps $15 billion annually across all investment activities. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Please inform your board of directors that they have 24 hours to propose a comprehensive plan for returning these profits to Africa, or I will release complete documentation of every transaction. Good day. By the time Traoré made his third call, the financial world was in chaos. David Chen's Reuters terminal was flashing urgent alerts. European banking stocks in free fall. Emergency trading halts triggered in London and Paris. Federal Reserve monitoring situation. Deutsche Bank was next. The German banking executive, a woman named Dr. Ingrid Weber, answered with barely controlled panic. President Traoré, we've been monitoring the news feeds. We are prepared to cooperate fully with any legitimate inquiry. Dr. Weber, your honesty is refreshing. Please tell the journalists your African holdings. $156 billion in various account types, generating approximately $18 billion in annual investment returns while paying average interest rates of 0.3%. Credit Suisse followed, then J.P. Morgan Chase. With each call, the pattern was identical. Massive African deposits, minimal interest payments, enormous profits from investing African money. The systematic nature of the exploitation became undeniable. By the fifth call to HSBC, the executive didn't even attempt resistance. Victoria Reynolds, head of international private banking, spoke with resigned professionalism. President Traoré, we hold $146 billion in African origin funds. We pay minimal interest as per standard commercial rates. We profit enormously from investing these funds. What specific reforms do you require? Ms. Reynolds, your refreshing honesty deserves a direct response. I want a complete forensic audit of all African funds, including detailed tracking of how personal accounts that should contain sovereign wealth ended up under private control. I want a profit-sharing agreement that reflects the true value African deposits provide to your bank, and I want all of this announced publicly within 48 hours. The board will never authorize... Ms. Reynolds, your board is about to discover that every major African nation is coordinating simultaneous withdrawal procedures. The banking crisis of 2008 will appear as a minor inconvenience compared to what's approaching if you refuse to cooperate. The sixth call marked a shift in Traoré's strategy. Instead of another bank, he dialed someone the journalists didn't expect. Marcus Webb speaking. Mr. Webb, for the benefit of the journalists listening, please identify yourself and your role in today's revelations. There was a brief chuckle, the sound of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Certainly. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm what you might call a financial systems specialist. I previously worked for the United States National Security Agency, specializing in cryptocurrency tracking and international financial intelligence. I've been working privately for President Traoré for the past 6 months. The journalists were frantically Googling Marcus Webb NSA, finding only sparse references to a cryptography expert who had supposedly died in a plane crash 3 years earlier. The implications were staggering. Either this was an imposter, or a supposedly dead NSA agent was working for an African president. Mr. Webb, please explain to these journalists what you discovered during your investigation. Certainly. Using a combination of public financial disclosures, leaked documents from various sources, advanced pattern analysis, and some creative interpretation of publicly available data, I've identified approximately $4.8 trillion in funds of clear African origin currently held in banks across Europe, America, and Asia. Sarah Mitchell couldn't contain herself. Mr. Webb, are you stating that there's nearly $5 trillion of African money outside of Africa? That's exactly what I'm stating, Ms. Mitchell. But here's where it becomes truly interesting from a systemic risk perspective. These African deposits serve as the collateral foundation for approximately $18 trillion in leveraged investments across global markets. If Africa coordinated simultaneous withdrawal of these funds, it wouldn't merely affect the banks holding the deposits. It would trigger a cascade of margin calls, forced liquidations, and credit defaults that would make the 2008 crisis appear as a mere rehearsal for economic collapse. James Patterson was updating his Bloomberg estimates in real time, watching as algorithmic trading systems began processing the implications of Webb's revelations. Mr. Webb, you're describing the potential for total global financial system collapse. Mr. Patterson, I'm describing what happens when an unjust system is forced to confront its own contradictions. The global financial system has been stable only because its victims lacked the coordination to challenge it simultaneously. That coordination now exists. Traoré's voice returned with an announcement that would reshape geopolitics. Journalists, it's time for you to understand the full scope of what you're witnessing. I'm now going to conference in 4 African leaders who have been listening to everything you've heard. They will speak for themselves. The speakerphone crackled as multiple connections were established. 4 distinct voices emerged, each speaking with the authority of sovereign leadership. President William Kamau of Kenya, President Aminata Diallo of Senegal, President John Mensa of Ghana, President Samuel Okono of Nigeria. The journalists gasped audibly. These weren't minor African leaders. They represented economies that together accounted for nearly half of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP, controlled vast oil reserves, major ports, and some of the world's largest gold and mineral deposits. President Okono of Nigeria spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of Africa's most populous nation. Journalists, what President Traoré has revealed confirms what we have suspected and privately investigated for years. Our wealth has been systematically diverted to build Western economies, while our people endure preventable poverty. This extraction ends immediately. President Kamau's Kenyan accent was crisp. Decisive. Effective at midnight tonight, Kenya is initiating withdrawal procedures for all governmental funds held in foreign banks. Our preliminary calculations suggest this totals approximately $180 billion. We are also implementing immediate requirements that all companies operating in Kenya maintain their primary operational accounts in Kenyan financial institutions. President Diallo's voice carried quiet steel. Senegal is implementing identical measures. Additionally, we are placing immediate holds on all new resource extraction contracts pending comprehensive audits of existing profit-sharing arrangements. President Mensa delivered what many would later call the economic killing blow. Ghana is going further than our colleagues. We are initiating forensic recovery proceedings for all resource extraction profits since independence in 1957. Our preliminary estimates suggest approximately $320 billion in wealth was extracted that should have remained in Ghana. We will recover this through legal means, trade adjustments, or direct seizure of assets. The conference room had become the epicenter of the biggest economic story in modern history. Every journalist was simultaneously filing reports, taking calls from editors, and trying to process the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Sarah Mitchell managed to ask the question that defined the moment. President Traoré, are you coordinating a mass withdrawal of African funds from Western banks? Ms. Mitchell, I am not coordinating anything beyond the revelation of truth. What African nations choose to do with that truth represents their sovereign decision-making. However, I can confirm that 26 African nations have agreed to coordinate simultaneous withdrawal procedures if Western financial institutions refuse to implement profit-sharing agreements within 96 hours. James Patterson was calculating frantically. President Traoré, a coordinated withdrawal of the magnitude you're describing would trigger immediate global banking crisis. Credit markets would freeze within hours. International trade would effectively stop. You're describing worldwide economic recession. Traoré's response would be remembered as one of the most powerful statements in modern diplomatic history. Mr. Patterson, Africa has been experiencing permanent economic recession for 60 years, while our wealth builds skyscrapers in London and New York. If the global economy requires African poverty to function properly, then perhaps it deserves to stop functioning. At that moment, the first breaking news alerts began appearing on everyone's phones. Urgent. European bank stocks plummet as African withdrawal threat emerges. Within minutes, the alerts were cascading faster than anyone could read. Société Générale stock down 23% in panic trading. Barclays suspends trading after 31% drop. Federal Reserve announces emergency market. Monitoring. President Okono's voice cut through the digital chaos. Journalists, you should understand that this is not an empty threat or negotiating bluff. Nigeria alone possesses legal authority to freeze approximately $60 billion in resource payments to international companies. We have prepared the executive orders. They require only my signature for immediate implementation. The tension in the conference room was palpable as President Traoré concluded his call with the mining executives. The 14 journalists sat in stunned silence, their recording equipment capturing every word of what was rapidly becoming the most significant diplomatic event of the century. Sarah Mitchell glanced at her colleague, James Crawford from the Financial Times, who was frantically scribbling notes while simultaneously live-tweeting the unprecedented developments. Suddenly, the secure phone line crackled to life again. This time, the voice that emerged carried the weight of European financial authority, older, measured, and speaking with a distinct French accent that immediately commanded attention. President Traoré, this is François Dubois, President of the European Central Bank. I have been connected to this call through emergency financial crisis. Protocols established after the 2008 collapse. The journalists exchanged glances of disbelief. They were now witnessing direct diplomatic contact between African leaders and the head of Europe's central banking system, a conversation that would normally take place through multiple layers of diplomatic channels and behind closed doors. President Traoré leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing as he responded with icy politeness. Mr. Dubois, how can I assist you? I assume this is not a social call? President Traoré, what you are orchestrating will destroy the global financial system, Dubois began, his voice carrying barely controlled urgency. The economic consequences will be catastrophic not just for Europe, but for the entire world, including Africa. Markets are already in panic across 3 continents. The Dow has dropped 800 points in the last hour alone. Sarah Mitchell noted the irony. Here was the head of European banking warning an African president about consequences for Africa, as if 6 decades of systematic extraction hadn't already been catastrophic for the continent. President Traoré's response cut through the room like a blade. Mr. Dubois, what we are doing is revealing that the global economy has been built on systematic theft. If returning stolen wealth destroys this system, what does that tell you about the foundation it was built upon? Perhaps the real question is why you built an economy so fragile that justice threatens its existence. Please, President Traoré, we can negotiate reasonable reforms, Dubois pleaded, his diplomatic composure beginning to crack. There are established channels for addressing these concerns. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the G20. We have been negotiating for 60 years through those exact channels, Mr. Dubois, Traoré interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Those negotiations consistently resulted in continued extraction while offering symbolic gestures toward development. Debt relief programs that forgave 5% while maintaining structures that extracted 50%. Development aid that required purchasing from donor countries at inflated prices. Trade agreements that guaranteed raw material exports while preventing value-added manufacturing. The negotiations are concluded. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Traoré continued, his voice carried the finality of a judge delivering sentence. You have 96 hours to propose comprehensive profit-sharing agreements, legitimate debt forgiveness for loans that enabled extraction rather than development, and concrete plans for repatriation of African wealth currently held in European institutions. Otherwise, we withdraw everything, every deposit, every investment, every sovereign fund, every pension contribution from African workers in European companies. Another phone began ringing insistently in the conference room. One of the bank officials, a young woman who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, answered with trembling hands. As she listened, her face went visibly pale, and she looked directly at President Traoré with barely concealed panic. "President Traoré," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "The White House is calling. President Harrison wishes to speak with you directly." The room fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment. This was unprecedented, the President of the United States calling directly into an African banking conference. Sarah Mitchell realized she was witnessing the moment when Africa's economic leverage became undeniably clear to the world's most powerful nation. "Put the call through," Traoré said calmly, as if receiving calls from the American president was a daily occurrence. The voice of President Harrison filled the room through the conference speakers, carrying barely controlled urgency mixed with the measured tones of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any conversation. "President Traoré, I understand you're making important points about economic equity, and these are conversations we should have. But threatening the stability of the global financial system is not the appropriate method for addressing these legitimate concerns." Traoré's interruption was swift and devastating. "President Harrison, I am not threatening anything. I am exercising exactly the same sovereign rights over our resources and financial assets that America would exercise in similar circumstances. When China attempted to purchase American ports, you blocked the transactions for national security reasons. When foreign entities tried to control American banks, you prevented it through legislation. When European companies sought to acquire American technology firms, you created CFIUS to stop them. We are simply applying identical sovereignty principles to our own wealth." "The situation is fundamentally different," Harrison began. "How is it different, President Harrison?" Traoré's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Because we are African? Because our sovereignty matters less than yours? Because when America protects its economic interests, its national security, but when Africa does the same, it's threatening global stability?" The pause that followed was deafening. When Traoré continued, he delivered what many would later call the most devastating economic argument of the 21st century. Wall Street financial institutions make approximately $340 billion annually from trading African resources and managing African wealth. That exceeds the entire GDP of most African nations. Goldman Sachs alone made $47 billion last year from commodity trading, much of it African resources. J.P. Morgan Chase holds $89 billion in African sovereign funds while African children lack clean water. Who exactly is exploiting whom in this relationship, President Harrison? The American president's response, when it came, carried a tone of barely concealed desperation. "President Traoré, we need time to assess these demands. The markets require stability to function properly. A coordinated withdrawal would create chaos not just in Western markets, but globally." "President Harrison," Traoré replied with devastating calm, "the markets have had 60 years to function properly while extracting African wealth. They chose to build their stability on our instability. They now have 96 hours to return what they took. The countdown continues, and it will not be extended." As if on cue, another breaking alert buzzed through the room. A CNN journalist read from her phone. Federal Reserve announces emergency liquidity provision of $2 trillion to prevent banking system collapse. European Central Bank follows with $1.5 trillion emergency measure. But the psychological damage was already complete. The revelation that the global financial system was so dependent on African wealth that its withdrawal could trigger emergency measures had fundamentally altered the balance of economic power. Markets were in freefall across 3 continents, and the world was beginning to understand that Africa was not the supplicant in this relationship. It was the creditor. What happened next would be studied in economics textbooks for generations as the most rapid realignment of global power in modern history. As news of the Abidjan calls spread through interconnected financial networks faster than any traditional media could report, other regions began to reassess their own relationships with Western financial institutions with stunning speed. The conference room's secure lines had become the unofficial headquarters of a revolution that was spreading across continents in real time. Sarah Mitchell watched in fascination as President Traoré's phone displayed incoming calls from heads of state she had only seen on international news broadcasts. The next call would transform the situation from an African protest to something far more dangerous to the established order. President Traoré, this is Governor Priya Sharma of the Reserve Bank of India. I have been monitoring your communications through established central bank emergency protocols, and I must say, your arguments are compelling. The journalists in the room collectively held their breath. Governor Sharma was not just any central bank official. She was one of the most respected monetary policy experts in the world, having guided India's economy through multiple global crises with remarkable skill. Her words carried weight that extended far beyond India's borders. Governor Sharma, Traoré responded, his voice betraying the first hint of surprise he had shown all day. I am honored by your attention to our situation. How can Africa assist India? President Traoré, the question is how India can assist Africa. We have faced similar systematic extraction for centuries. British colonial extraction from India totaled approximately $45 trillion in today's currency over 2 centuries. But the extraction didn't end with political independence. It merely became more sophisticated. India currently maintains approximately $1 trillion in Western banking, institutions that could potentially be subject to coordinated withdrawal. The addition of India transformed the situation from a regional African crisis to a global South uprising that threatened the very foundations of the post-World War II economic order. If India joined the coordinated withdrawal, the global financial system wouldn't face crisis. It would face complete collapse. James Crawford from the Financial Times was typing furiously on his laptop, trying to calculate the combined economic leverage being assembled in real time. This is beyond unprecedented, he whispered to Sarah Mitchell. They're essentially creating a new Bretton Woods system through conference calls. Governor Sharma, Traoré responded, his tactical mind clearly recognizing the game-changing nature of this alliance. We welcome all nations seeking genuine economic sovereignty. Our principles are entirely consistent: fair profit sharing on invested funds based on actual risk and contribution, comprehensive debt restructuring to eliminate illegitimate extraction-based loans, and technology transfer without political conditionality or restrictions designed to maintain dependency. We find these principles not only reasonable, but essential for true independence, Sharma replied. President Traoré, may I conference in representatives from Brazil and Indonesia? President Silva and President Widodo have expressed similar concerns through diplomatic channels over the past week. They've been watching your actions with great interest. Please do, Governor Sharma. Justice is not an African concern. It is a human concern. Within 15 minutes, the Abidjan calls had evolved into a global South economic coalition representing over half of the world's population and controlling the majority of natural resources essential for modern civilization. Brazil brought its vast agricultural exports and mineral wealth. Indonesia added its strategic position controlling major shipping lanes and its enormous palm oil and natural gas reserves. Combined with India's massive economy and Africa's resource abundance, this coalition controlled the real foundation of global economic activity. President Silva of Brazil was the first to speak when connected. President Traoré, Brazil has $800 billion in investments and deposits in Western financial institutions. We've been discussing similar actions regarding our agricultural and mineral exports. The timing appears optimal for coordinated action. President Widodo of Indonesia followed. Indonesia controls shipping lanes that carry 25% of global trade. We've been concerned about the terms of our resource agreements for some time. Perhaps coordination serves all our interests. President Harrison's voice returned to the call, now carrying barely controlled desperation that was evident even through the secure connection. President Traoré, please. We need time to assess these demands. The markets require stability to function properly. You're talking about disrupting $4 trillion in interconnected financial relationships. President Harrison, Traoré replied with devastating calm. The markets have had 60 years to function properly while extracting wealth from the global south. They chose to build their stability on our instability, their prosperity on our poverty. They now have 96 hours to return what they took. The countdown continues. Another breaking alert buzzed through the room. This time it was Maria Santos from Reuters reading from her phone. London Stock Exchange has suspended trading. Frankfurt closes early. Tokyo futures market in freefall. Federal Reserve announces second emergency liquidity injection of $1.5 trillion. This is beyond a financial crisis. This is a complete system breakdown. But it was already too late for emergency measures. The psychological damage was complete. The revelation that the global south possessed economic leverage that could bring down the entire Western financial system had fundamentally altered international power dynamics forever. The age of economic colonialism was ending not with war, but with the simple exercise of sovereign financial rights that Western nations had always claimed for themselves. Governor Sharma's voice cut through the chaos with clinical precision. The combined financial leverage of this coalition represents approximately $6.8 trillion in immediately withdrawable assets, control over 60% of global mineral resources, 40% of agricultural production, and strategic control of shipping lanes carrying 30% of international trade. The Western financial system has built itself on a foundation it never controlled. Today, they discover what that means. Sarah. Mitchell realized she was witnessing the moment when the global south discovered its own power and decided to use it as the immediate crisis unfolded across global financial markets. Other major powers began positioning themselves for the post-extraction economy that was clearly emerging. The old certainties of Western economic dominance were crumbling in real time, and nations that had remained on the sidelines were now scrambling to align themselves with what appeared to be the winning coalition. The secure phone lines in the Abidjan conference room had effectively become the nerve center of a new international order. Sarah Mitchell marveled at how quickly the established hierarchy of global power was being rewritten through nothing more than coordinated economic pressure and transparent communication. Premier Chen of China had been monitoring the situation from Beijing, and his request to join the call came exactly 90 minutes after India's entry, a timeline that suggested careful calculation rather than spontaneous reaction. President Traoré, this is Premier Chen Xiaoping. China has always maintained fraternal relationships with African nations and supports the legitimate aspirations of developing countries. We would like to discuss how China might contribute to constructive solutions. The entry of China transformed the dynamics yet again. Unlike the Western powers who were clearly on the defensive, China was positioning itself as a potential ally. But President Traoré's response demonstrated that the new coalition would not simply replace Western exploitation with Chinese alternatives. Premier Chen, China currently holds approximately $400 billion in African governmental loans and another $600 billion in resource-backed securities through the Belt and Road Initiative. Your financial institutions are as exposed to coordinated African action as Western ones, perhaps more so given the concentration of your investments. The question is whether China chooses to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute, an eternity in the high-stakes world of international diplomacy. When Premier Chen responded, his carefully measured words revealed the strategic calculations happening in real time in Beijing. What would being part of the solution entail, President Traoré? complete debt restructuring based on fair market valuations rather than inflated crisis pricing, genuine profit-sharing agreements on all resource extraction ventures with majority benefits flowing to African nations, unconditional technology transfer without political strings or dependency-creating terms, and respect for African sovereignty in all economic relationships. In exchange, China receives preferred partnership, status in the emerging African economic architecture, and guaranteed access to resources at market prices rather than extraction prices. There was another strategically timed pause before Premier Chen responded. These terms require consultation with the Politburo Standing Committee. Do we also have 96 hours to provide a comprehensive response? Everyone has 96 hours, Premier Chen. This is about justice, not favoritism. The same terms apply to all nations. Return what was taken, share fairly in the future, and respect sovereignty. These principles are universal. President Volkov of Russia joined the call shortly after, his deep voice carrying the calculated confidence of someone who had been analyzing the situation for hours before speaking. President Traoré. Russia has always supported African independence and maintains historical ties with many liberation movements. We would also like to discuss constructive partnerships. President Volkov, Russia's direct exposure to African wealth is smaller than Western or Chinese levels, approximately $180 billion in various investments and resource agreements, but your resource extraction has followed similar patterns of unequal exchange. Same terms apply. Profit sharing based on genuine contribution rather than military or political leverage, debt restructuring for fair terms, and technology transfer without strategic dependency creation. What was becoming clear to the journalists in the room was that President Traoré and his allies were not seeking to simply rearrange the existing exploitative system with different beneficiaries. They were demanding fundamental restructuring based on principles of equity and sovereignty that would apply universally. President Macron of France, who had been notably absent from the calls despite France's massive exposure to African economies through the CFA franc system and extensive corporate investments, finally requested to join the conversation. His entry would prove to be one of the most contentious moments of the entire crisis. President Traoré, this is President Macron. France and Africa share deep historical relationships and cultural bonds that transcend mere economic calculations. President Macron, Traoré interrupted with barely controlled anger. France has extracted approximately $500 billion annually from Africa through the CFA franc system alone. French corporations control 80% of Ivorian cocoa production, while Ivorian farmers live in poverty. Total French extraction from Africa exceeds $800 billion annually, while France provides $12 billion in aid and calls it generous. Do not speak to me about historical relationships when that history is theft. The harshness of Traoré's response silenced the room. Even the experienced journalists were taken aback by the direct confrontation with a Western head of state. President Traoré, surely we can find solutions that preserve beneficial relationships while addressing legitimate concerns. Macron attempted. The CFA franc system ends within these 96 hours, President Macron. 14 African nations will be removing their monetary sovereignty from French control. The economic agreements that give French companies privileged access to African resources end. The military agreements that protect French economic interests end. France will compete for African partnerships on equal terms with everyone else, or France will have no partnerships at all. The implications were staggering. The CFA franc system had been one of the most enduring legacies of formal colonialism, binding 14 African nations to French monetary policy and guaranteeing French economic dominance. Its termination would represent the final end of Europe's formal economic empire in Africa. James Crawford leaned over to Sarah Mitchell. He's not just demanding reparations. He's dismantling the entire post-colonial economic structure in real time. The cascade of calls continued as smaller but strategically important. Nations sought to position themselves in the emerging order. The UAE offered to serve as a neutral banking hub for the transition. Singapore proposed hosting the new global South financial institutions. Even Switzerland, whose banking system held enormous amounts of African wealth, began preliminary discussions about returning funds and reforming banking secrecy laws. By the end of the day, what had begun as bilateral calls between African leaders and individual banks had evolved into the most comprehensive realignment of global economic power since the end of World War II. The Global South had discovered its collective leverage and was using it with devastating effectiveness. Perhaps the most shocking moment in the entire crisis came when President Traoré made an unexpected call that stunned even the experienced international journalists who thought they had seen everything. Sarah Mitchell had covered Vatican finances for years and knew the extreme secrecy that surrounded the Holy See's economic operations. What happened next would expose one of the world's most protected financial secrets on live recording. Alessandro Rossi speaking. The voice was cautious, speaking in accented English that carried the formal tones of Vatican bureaucracy. Mr. Rossi, please identify yourself fully for the journalists present and the global audience that will hear this recording. My name is Alessandro Rossi. I am the Director General of the Institute for the Works of Religion, Vatican City State. The journalists in the room froze. The Institute for the Works of Religion was the official name of the Vatican Bank, one of the world's most secretive financial institutions. For decades, it had operated behind walls of canonical law and diplomatic immunity that had protected it from virtually any external scrutiny. Financial journalists had spent careers trying to get even basic information about its operations. Maria Santos from Reuters whispered urgently to her colleague, "This is impossible. The Vatican Bank never acknowledges anything publicly. How did he even get their direct line?" President Traoré's next words provided the answer and sent shockwaves through the room. Mr. Rossi, how much African wealth does the Vatican Bank currently hold? And under what circumstances was this wealth deposited? President Traoré, the Vatican Bank's holdings are strictly confidential under canonical law and international agreements established by the Lateran Treaty. We cannot disclose. Mr. Rossi, Traoré interrupted with deadly calm. I possess complete documentation showing that the Vatican Bank holds approximately $50 billion connected to African resources, much of it deposited by African leaders seeking to hide wealth from their own people, and much of it connected to resource extraction companies seeking tax advantages through Vatican financial services. Would you prefer I release this documentation to the journalists present, or will you cooperate with transparency? The pause that followed lasted 47 seconds. Sarah Mitchell timed it precisely. When Rossi spoke again, his voice carried the resignation of someone who had been outmaneuvered completely. President Traoré, the Catholic Church has always stood with the poor and oppressed throughout history. Our financial operations are intended to support the Church's charitable mission worldwide. Then stand with them now, Mr. Rossi. Return what was stolen in the name of faith. The Vatican Bank holds $23 billion deposited by the former dictator of Equatorial Guinea, $12 billion from Congolese mining operations that paid nothing to the Congolese people, $8 billion from Nigerian oil revenues that never reached Nigerian development, and $7 billion from various African leaders who died leaving their people in poverty while enriching Vatican accounts. The specificity of the figures stunned everyone present. These weren't general accusations. This was detailed financial intelligence that could only have come from inside sources or sophisticated intelligence operations. How do you have this information? Rossi asked, his diplomatic composure completely abandoned. Mr. Rossi, when you systematically extract wealth from people, those people eventually develop systems to track where it goes. African intelligence services are far more capable than Western institutions assumed. We know exactly where our wealth is hidden, who helped hide it, and how to recover it. I will need to consult with His Holiness immediately, Rossi replied, his voice barely steady. You have 96 hours like everyone else, Mr. Rossi. But let me be clear about the consequences of non-cooperation. We possess documentation not just of the Vatican Bank's African holdings, but of how those deposits were used to fund European corporations' African operations. We know about the circular financing schemes that allowed companies to extract resources using loans secured by the same African wealth they were extracting. The choice is return the funds voluntarily or have the entire system exposed to global scrutiny. The threat was clear and devastating. The Vatican Bank's reputation for secrecy would not survive the release of detailed documentation showing how church finances had facilitated African exploitation. James Crawford leaned toward Sarah Mitchell. He just forced transparency from the Vatican Bank. In 30 years of financial journalism, I never thought I'd see this happen. The moral authority of the Catholic Church depends on its commitment to justice and the poor, Traoré continued relentlessly. How will that authority survive the revelation that church finances profited from African poverty? How will Catholics worldwide react when they learn their donations helped hide stolen wealth rather than feed the hungry? The Vatican call revealed something crucial that had been developing throughout the crisis. This was not just an economic confrontation, but a moral one. President Traoré was systematically exposing how every major Western institution, banks, governments, corporations, and now religious organizations, had participated in or facilitated African exploitation. President Traoré, Rossi said finally, "If we cooperate fully with repatriation, can discretion be maintained regarding the operational details?" Mr. Rossi, discretion was lost when the Vatican chose to hold stolen African wealth. Full transparency is now required. The African people deserve to know how their resources were hidden and by whom. However, full cooperation with immediate repatriation will be noted favorably when the complete documentation is released. After the Vatican call ended, the room remained silent for several minutes. Sarah Mitchell realized they had witnessed something unprecedented. The systematic dismantling of financial secrecy that had protected exploitation for decades. Every institution that had participated was being exposed and forced to choose between voluntary cooperation and public humiliation. The Vatican revelation also demonstrated the sophistication of the African coalition's intelligence capabilities. They weren't making broad accusations. They had specific, detailed financial information that could only have come from years of careful investigation and documentation. As the 96-hour deadline approached, the focus shifted from crisis management to articulating the vision for a post-extraction global economy. President Mensah of Ghana, widely respected as one of Africa's most thoughtful economic minds, had requested time to address what many considered the defining question of the new era. What would replace the system they were dismantling? The conference room had evolved over the past day into something resembling a war room for economic revolution. Charts covered the walls showing financial flows, resource movements, and the cascading effects of coordinated withdrawal. The 14 journalists had become not just observers, but historians, documenting the birth of a new international order. "I want to address something directly to those listening around the world," President Mensah began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent decades studying economic development. "People will claim we are being irresponsible, that we are risking global economic stability for political purposes. But I ask you to consider, whose stability are we risking?" Sarah Mitchell noticed how Mensah's approach differed from Traoré's confrontational style. Where Traoré used devastating directness, Mensah employed careful reasoning that built arguments step by logical step. When our children cannot afford food while their gold builds your monetary reserves, is that stability? When our university graduates cannot find employment in their own countries while their oil funds your stock markets and creates your prosperity, is that stability? When our farmers live in poverty while their cocoa creates billion-dollar chocolate industries they will never benefit from, is that stability? The questions hung in the air, each one building toward a conclusion that would reframe how the world understood economic stability itself. "We are not destabilizing anything," Mensah continued with devastating logic. "We are revealing that what you called stability was never genuinely stable. It was merely unequal. True stability cannot be built on systematic exploitation because exploitation always generates resistance. What you are witnessing is not the creation of instability, but the exposure of instability that always existed beneath the surface." President Kamau of Kenya, joining the call from Nairobi, added the forward-looking perspective that would guide the new economic relationships. The question now becomes, what replaces extraction? The answer is partnership. Africa possesses the youngest population globally, over 60% under age 25. We have the most abundant natural resources on the planet. We have unlimited potential for development and innovation. All we have lacked is control of our own capital. Once we recover that control, the 21st century becomes Africa's century. The vision Kamau articulated was revolutionary, not because it was aggressive, but because it was optimistic. This wasn't just about returning stolen wealth. It was about unleashing African potential that had been systematically suppressed. Consider what Africa could accomplish with fair returns on our resources. Kamau continued. Nigeria alone has oil reserves worth $40 trillion at current prices. But Nigeria has received perhaps $800 billion over 60 years, while international companies extracted the rest. Imagine Nigerian development if Nigerians controlled Nigerian oil profits. President Okono, Nigeria's leader, provided the concrete example that made the vision tangible. Nigeria will demonstrate this new model immediately. Our oil continues flowing to international markets because the world needs energy. But payments now go to escrow accounts that we control completely. Any attempt to seize our tankers, block our legitimate shipments, or freeze our sovereign assets will be considered an act of economic warfare. We are not threatening the global economy. We are revealing that it has always threatened us. The implications extended far beyond Nigeria. If African nations controlled their resource revenues, they could fund development, education, and industrialization on scales previously impossible. The Global South was not just demanding reparations. It was preparing to eclipse the North. Economically, President Diouf of Senegal articulated what many considered the philosophical foundation of the new order. For centuries, we were told that poverty was our natural condition. That development required Western expertise and Western capital. But the largest transfers of wealth in human history have been from Africa to Europe and America. We provided the capital. We provided the resources. We provided the labor. What we lacked was control. Today we take back control. The vision was becoming clear to the journalists documenting these historic calls. This wasn't just economic nationalism, it was economic liberation on a continental scale. Africa was preparing to claim its position as the world's dominant economic region based on its resource wealth, young population, and accumulated knowledge from decades of studying its own exploitation. Maria Santos from Reuters posed the question many were thinking. President Mensah, this vision assumes successful transition from the current system. What happens if Western powers refuse your terms and choose conflict over cooperation? Mensah's response revealed the strategic thinking behind the entire operation. Ms. Santos, that question assumes we need Western cooperation for our success. We don't. We need Western compliance with international law and respect for sovereignty. If they choose conflict, they choose it without African resources, without African markets, and without African cooperation on global challenges like climate change that require African participation. The question is whether they can afford that choice, not whether we can. The psychological shift was complete. Africa had stopped asking for Western assistance and started offering Western partnership on African terms. The continent that had been portrayed as dependent and needy was revealing itself as the indispensable foundation of global prosperity. The final 24 hours before the withdrawal deadline transformed into the most intense period of international diplomacy since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Emergency meetings ran continuously in Washington, London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo as governments, and financial institutions worked frantically to prevent what economists were already calling the end of the post-colonial economic order. Sarah Mitchell had barely slept in 3 days, surviving on coffee and adrenaline as she documented what was clearly the most significant economic story of the century. The conference room in Abidjan had become the unofficial nerve center of a global crisis, with secure phone lines connecting African leaders to heads of state and central bankers around the world. But as the deadline approached, cracks began appearing in what had initially seemed like unified Western resistance to African demands. The first break came from an unexpected source, Germany's Chancellor Müller, whose midnight call to President Traoré would reshape the entire crisis. President Traoré, this is Chancellor Müller. I am calling to inform you that Germany will support comprehensive debt restructuring and profit-sharing agreements rather than risk total economic collapse. We cannot allow ideological positions to destroy the global economy. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room and immediately triggered a cascade of similar calls. Germany's decision represented more than just economic pragmatism. It was recognition that the African coalition held genuinely decisive leverage. Chancellor Traoré responded with careful diplomacy. Germany's wisdom in recognizing reality is appreciated. We look forward to building genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than historical exploitation. Within hours, the dominoes began falling rapidly. The Netherlands followed Germany's lead, with Prime Minister Van der Berg announcing that Dutch institutions would comply with profit-sharing demands for all African investments. Denmark quickly announced similar measures, followed by Norway, whose sovereign wealth fund held enormous African assets. But the most surprising defection came from Japan. Prime Minister Tanaka's call revealed strategic calculations that none of the Western observers had anticipated. President Traoré, Japan has concluded that cooperation with African development serves Japanese interests better than supporting a system that may collapse regardless of our position. Japan offers full compliance with your terms plus an additional $50 billion in development financing for African industrialization. Japan's offer revealed the deeper strategic implications of the crisis. Nations were beginning to compete for favorable positions in the post-extraction economy rather than defending the extraction system itself. President Harrison made one final attempt to preserve American leadership in the crisis, but his call revealed the limits of traditional diplomatic pressure when facing genuine economic leverage. President Traoré, the United States is prepared to offer significant concessions, but we need guarantees about stability and continued cooperation on global security issues. Traoré's response was devastating in its simplicity. President Harrison, you are still thinking in terms of what America will offer Africa. The relevant question is what Africa will accept from America. We are no longer supplicants in this relationship. We are creditors collecting debts. The psychological shift was complete. After centuries of being treated as passive recipients of Western decisions, Africa had claimed the position of setting terms for global economic relationships. By hour 84, with 12 hours remaining before the withdrawal deadline, even the Federal Reserve and European Central Bank jointly announced comprehensive willingness to negotiate structural reforms rather than face systematic collapse of the international banking system. The final hours saw emergency negotiating teams working frantically in multiple time zones. The African coalition had established negotiating headquarters in Abidjan, New York, London, and Geneva simultaneously, with teams of lawyers, economists, and diplomats hammering out the details of agreements that would reshape global finance. Sarah Mitchell watched in fascination as the world's most powerful institutions bent themselves to accommodate African demands that would have been dismissed as fantasy just 1 week earlier. The revelation of African economic leverage had fundamentally altered international power dynamics. At 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the withdrawal deadline, President Traoré received confirmation that preliminary agreements had been reached with all major financial institutions and most Western governments. The terms were not everything the African coalition had demanded, but they represented more progress toward economic justice than 60 years of traditional negotiation had achieved. At exactly 96 hours after President Traoré's first call to Société Générale, he returned to address the world. The Global South Coalition has reached preliminary agreements with major financial institutions and several government entities. These agreements include $4 trillion in immediate debt forgiveness for loans that facilitated extraction rather than development, annual profit sharing worth $80 billion from African deposits and investments, technology transfer agreements valued at $500 billion over 5 years, and repatriation of $1.8 trillion in African wealth over the next 5 years. The agreements also established African-controlled development banks, restructured resource extraction to ensure majority African benefit, and created transparency requirements that would prevent future exploitation. It wasn't everything the African coalition had demanded, but it represented more progress toward economic justice than 60 years of traditional negotiation had achieved. 25 years after the Abidjan calls, the world had fundamentally transformed. The 14 journalists who witnessed those historic phone calls had become legends in media history. Their recordings remained the most studied diplomatic documents ever released. Sarah Mitchell, still living in Ouagadougou, reflected, "We witnessed the end of one world and the beginning of another, not through war or revolution, but through phone calls that told the truth. It seems almost impossible in retrospect, but we were there." The conference room where it happened was preserved as a historical site, visited by millions seeking to understand how the modern world had been shaped. The recordings had become required listening for anyone studying economics, diplomacy, or international relations. Future historians marked the calls as the dividing point between two eras, the era of exploitation and the era of transparency. Before Traoré's calls, wealth could be hidden, theft could be disguised, and exploitation could be normalized. After the calls, none of this remained possible. The world that emerged was not perfect, but it was more just. Africa's wealth increasingly stayed in Africa. The Global South found ways to cooperate without Northern intermediation. The financial system, rebuilt on more equitable foundations, proved more stable than the exploitative system it replaced. And it had all started with President Ibrahim Traoré picking up a phone and asking simple questions that no one had dared ask before. Where is our money? Why don't we control it? What are you doing with it? The answers to those questions had changed everything.